Welcome back to the New Indian Express's ThinkEdu Conclave 2021. Our first speaker, Sanjeev Sanyal, is currently serving as the Principal Economic Advisor in the Ministry of Finance. Sanyal, a Rhodes Scholar and Eisenhower Fellow, he was Deutsche Bank's Global Strategist and a Managing Director till 2015. He is also the author of several books, including The Indian Renaissance, India's Rise After 1,000 Years of Decline, Land of the Seven Rivers, A Brief History of India's Geography. Our second speaker, Arun Maira, is a management consultant and former member of the Planning Commission of India. He is also former India chairman of Boston Consulting Group. The speakers will be in conversation with author and columnist Shankar Iyer.
So I'm going to sort of set it up, say that we all know where we are in terms of where the economy is. We are on the path of incipient recovery or robust recovery, depending on who's telling the story. We are also looking forward to more changes. And I must say that this has been my one of my old theories, that India transforms when there is a crisis, and crisis compels change. That was the subject of my first book, Accidental India. So I'm going to sort of start off there. So we had a crisis, there was a pandemic, and we moved on several fronts, on labor laws, on agriculture, productivity linked incentive schemes for manufacturing. We are now talking about privatization. So what do we need to do to sustain the current trajectory and to sustain growth in the future? So if you take a couple of minutes to set it up, then we'll come to Sanjeev, and then we'll take the discussion forward.
Thank you very much, Shankar. I'm so pleased that you invited me to be in this discussion with Sanjeev and with yourself. You had given us a nice briefing beforehand, in which you'd explained what you just said, using some other words also, which was, is India too chaotic for perennial change in the economy, or is every crisis an opportunity? And I felt that I come from the private sector, as you said. I've been a consultant to private sector and to government. And nowadays, the whole term for the last few years about the world has been, the world is in a VUCA stage. VUCA, volatility, uncertainty, complexity, ambiguity. And business people, business leaders are being taught how to strategize and implement change in a VUCA world. And the same applies to government, of course. So in a situation where, in a stage of the world's history, where things must keep changing and will keep changing, to talk about permanent change, it seems to me an oxymoron. But we should be saying change is permanent. And what we've got to do is to have the ability to thrive in permanent change. So with this, I want to reframe the question about reforms, and to say that what we need to do is to reform the process by which we have been making reforms, to make that process adapted to a VUCA world, where change will be constant, and it'll be complex because change is arising from many different sides of the system, infecting all other sides of the system at the same time, which is why it becomes so complex. So when I was in the Planning Commission, I'm going to just mention that, and then we can go further afterwards, is I was charged by the Prime Minister Manmohan Singh that, being a consultant to organizations around the world to live and thrive in a VUCA world, could I bring that knowledge that I had to the Planning Commission of India, which was an institution which was seemingly unable to catalyze adequate change and help the country to implement it, to bring about the sort of reforms you're talking about just now in land, labor, manufacturing, and so on. So with that, I did go to a journey of learning myself with the help of the World Bank, with the German Development Organization, GIZ, and many other people, to see how countries make complex reforms, and they have done it before. It's not the first time that any country is required to make a complex reform, including ourselves. And I learned something, and I might point out then about the two reforms when we talk of crisis. It is said very often that we were able to make the first generation reforms in 1991 because there was a crisis. And so now we are hoping that this COVID crisis will enable us to similarly make another set of reforms. The point is the two reforms are very different. The first, thank goodness we keep calling them the first generation and this one the second generation, because the second generation reforms are very different in their scope and their complexity compared to the first generation reforms. The first generation reforms affected a small set of stakeholders immediately who resisted that change, and it got gotten over. The second generation of reforms in land, in labor, in industrial policies that affect and trade policies that affect small people, small enterprises, and farmers and agriculture are reforms in which there are many stakeholders involved, small ones who have different situations and big ones around the country. So this is not a stroke of the pen type reform where, there's a crisis and then you say, okay, I give a speech and here's an announcement and you then thereafter have got the reform done. It doesn't happen like that. So we studied that and we came to certain conclusions, but I'd like to withhold giving those conclusions until you ask again. Thank you.
Fair enough. Fair enough. Sanjeev, we, under the Modi Sarkar, we've done some interesting disruptions, demonetization, then GST, the insolvency and bankruptcy code. Now, how they played out, how much of that brought impact is still an ongoing story. I think we'll have to wait for a calmer moment in history to sort of recognize what the benefits of those are. Certainly, the one aspect that has seemed delivered is the Aadhaar-based direct benefit transfer, which has sort of made transfers to people much more efficient, enabled opening, financial inclusion, and then other things. Now, in the last 6 months, we've had, I must say, a slew of reforms, and starting with how we sort of opened up some of the FDIs in some of the sectors. We have looked at the farm laws, expanded the productivity linked scheme, and also now we're talking about privatization. Now, when we look at the parade of these reforms, the one striking thing is that the factors of productivity, land, labor, and capital. So capital is still a matter of central policy, but land, labor are largely states. So would you sort of kindly set it up and say which part of the reforms the center has done and how you're propelling it further by getting the states to participate in it? The process itself, for instance, arguably the way the farm reforms were handled, I'm personally a sort of a proponent of whatever has been done in the farm reforms. This is something that should have been done decades ago. I mean, it took us 70 years to free the largest private sector in India, which is agriculture. But the process itself, whether that can be improved, because now we are coming at a confluence of policy changes which affect, as Ms. Maira said, a large landscape of stakeholders. So how are we doing this, and what do you think the government has in its mind to sort of take this forward?
I think the first and most important thing to realize is that we have a very consistent economic framework. So the intellectual framework of these reforms should be left in no doubt. We are about a strong but limited state. This is maybe quite different from both the extremes. On one side, the libertarian idea of a sort of very small state, and the Nehruvian idea of a weak but all pervasive state. We have a very clear view that there are certain things the state should do. So provide security, defense, provide infrastructure, and you will see those are the kinds of things we like investing in. On the other hand, we are quite unapologetic about doing things like privatization, opening up new sectors and so on. So first thing, I hope you appreciate that there is a clear, consistent view on how our economy should function. Secondly, no matter when you do these reforms, there will always be pushback, because the reason they do not get done is because, of course, there are people who have been sort of pushing back against it. Otherwise, they would have already been done, right? So at some point in time, once you have done a lot of discussion, you have to be willing to begin doing those reforms. One of the things you have to be prepared is, even those who have been great proponents of these reforms for decades will then stand up and say that, the exact way in which the reform was done was not quite correct. You will hear many lectures from academics based in the US about how actually the process should have been somewhat different from the one they had written in some paper years ago. But the fact is, almost all the reforms we are doing have been debated for decades. They are in the economic surveys, very often written by those who are now turned critics. And at some point in time, you have to be willing to go out and do them. Crisis or no crisis. And the important thing is, as Mr. Maira just pointed out, it is not merely a matter of making a grand announcement. You have to sit in there and manage its implementation into the future. So, very often, you have to be willing that when you first introduce the policy, it will initially not work, and you have to then correct it along the way. So, for example, the GST, we could have debated it for years, but the only known way of actually getting a country as complex as India to have a GST is to actually introduce it and then fix it. The same thing is true of the Insolvency and Bankruptcy Code. The same thing is true of 200 other reforms that we will do. We are happy for it to not quite work in the beginning and then fix it along the way. We have no ego about this. We will watch if it works. We will make tweaks and make it work. We are not of the opinion that just because we announce something, it will work in one shot. In fact, even the 1991 reforms needed lots of tweaking over the subsequent decade. So the point I'm making clearly is, we are in it for the long haul. We recognize that these reforms 2.0 will take some time. We recognize that there will be pushback, but we have to be willing to carry on. And yes, there will be moments where some of the pushback is legitimate. So even that you have to accommodate. So I think the issue here is to be clear about what we are doing in the medium to long run, introduce the changes and tweak them where necessary.
So Sanjeev, let me tempt you with a crystal ball and say that now where we are, what do you think the glide path is? Where are we sort of taking this forward in terms of the next steps? How do you get, for instance, I mean, for me, it's mystifying that although the BJP is in power in 15 states, the kind of evangelism or persuasion that should have been there in promoting the idea of the farm reforms, for instance, wasn't visible till the sort of agitation hit the roads. But that said, I mean, now Shivraj Chauhan and other people are sort of taking it further. But how do you get the states on board? For instance, two major programs of the government. One is water, drinking water, and the second is healthcare. Now, both require the states to deliver. In 1983, N.T. Ramarao said the center is a conceptual myth and every inch of India is ruled by the states, which is true and not so true because central policies are still made in Delhi. So how do you get the states to come on board? Because the pushback is off by APMC didn't get disbanded or the other things didn't happen. For instance, now the power minister has been talking about the need to liberate distribution, give consumer a choice. And that acquired heft only when the prime minister started speaking about it. So how do you make those things happen? That's the part I sort of wanted to hear from you. We get it that there is a consistency, that there is a certain approach this government has towards reforms, which is not a minted solution, but a solution which is sort of evolving all the time. But fair enough. I mean, that's how public policy works. But where do you see this heading? I mean, could you, for instance, look at the bad loans bank idea? Could you look at the development financial institution idea that has come up in the budget? I mean, we've had IFCI, UTI, IDBI, ICICI, IDFC, all these. They didn't work. So what gives the government the confidence that this will work this time? So, I mean, so there must be a certain calculation that you guys have worked out. I'm sure in your position as a principal economic advisor, you've been a part of it. And I have a very important question about the role of the state, which I will come to after I hear you and Mr. Maira.
So I think one of the things you need to understand is that our entire worldview is driven by a particular way of thinking about the future and uncertainty. That showed through repeatedly, even in the way we dealt, for example, with the COVID crisis, which is this, that uncertainty of the world is a given, and the way you deal with the future is through iterative approach. And you saw that even with our COVID handling. Now, given that that is how we think about the world in the first place, so therefore, how do we think about the post-COVID world? Well, the first thing that we are quite sure about is that the post-COVID world is not a reinflation of the pre-COVID world. It will have its own technology, it will have its own supply chains, it will have its own consumer behavior, unintended consequences of where all these things and how they interact. So it is important for us to have a broad idea and then keep at it. So some things will work very well with the states, some things won't. We will try them out. If something is so critical and it hasn't worked, we will go back to the drawing board and try it in a different way again. So now, for example, let me give, since you talked about dealing with the states, well, actually many things have worked rather well with the states. I mean, for all the criticism there was, actually, I mean, 99% of the time, the coordination between central and states in the COVID response was rather good. Otherwise, it wouldn't have worked at all. For all the whining and grinding that happens over the GST council, actually the GST largely works, and the states have the majority of the votes in the GST council. So there are many things that work. Many of the things like, for example, the Swachh Bharat toilet building program could not have happened without the states participating in it. So I think people give too much credence to the media noise about this friction and that friction and the political wranglings. A lot of work does get done. It is true some things don't get done, but then the key approach is to, if it is worthwhile doing, then try it again. And by the way, some things do work in certain states and not in others. Then the benefits of that from the state where it worked do ultimately filter through to the others. So I think the point is to have a approach of hammering away, pushing away iteratively, and try and get things done. I am not of the view that you have to have this great grand plan ex ante and then just implement it. That is precisely why we shut down the planning commission. It was not just about the difficulty of doing something. It's a conceptual problem we have with the idea of planning in that way. We don't like master planning. This is about iterative hammering away.
Okay, Mr. Maira. So we have heard from Sanjeev about the approach to how things happen. And this is different and similar to the approach that we've seen before. The one thing about the government is that when the Prime Minister takes up a project like a Jan Dhan Yojana or the subsidy sacrifice idea for LPG, or when he picks up something like, how to deal with the social aspects of poverty in the rural area, Ujjwala and stuff, and the rural electrification. These things get done efficiently. There is a certain element of efficiency in it. There is also the fact that, while Sanjeev might say that people pay too much credence to what appears on the media, what appears on the media is really what people are saying. So I must defend the media while we are on a media platform. So, and having been a journalist for 37 years, I think I owe it to my brethren that they speak. I mean, they may not reflect complete and total truth, but neither does the government. So, what would you like to see happen next to make India sort of rise to the challenge of the disruptions that, I mean, it is true that the world as it emerges from COVID will emerge into a cusp of disruptions, climate, technology, demography. Things are not going to be what they are. I mean, the new normal is probably the most cliched phrase that's being used in the current days. So what would you like to see as somebody who's been in consulting, somebody who's been in planning commission, somebody who's an observer of the policy impulse?
Yeah, thank you. Actually, Sanjeev has, put me in the place where I can build on what he's saying and what you have said. It's about, the planning commission was not delivering the goods. Okay, so that was the question that I was asked by Dr. Manmohan Singh to explore. What needs to change in the way we are going about planning and reforming so that we can produce results faster? The speed is important. Yes, reforms and policy making are iterative processes. You do reaction, you quickly learn or don't quickly learn, but just keep holding on to what you believe and don't learn. And so sometimes it takes, in some places, countries, it takes longer. In other countries, they're able to implement equally complex reforms faster. Both are iterative processes and learning processes. So it comes to who is learning faster, who is learning faster. And this was a conclusion that came when we compared the time that various countries have taken over the last 50, 60 years in different complex reforms, that India was probably amongst the slowest learners as a state, the slowest learners. It's a slow learning state. Sanjeev has put the point about the role of the state, and I'm glad we're talking about that, that it's neither this nor that. But the question is, what is the state? The state, and what is the state of our state? The state is a process, it's not a thing. And the state is created by the interactions of people and the decisions that they come to together, which we then say we are able to evolve our state and are always in a good state, don't feel a crisis. No, this is a bit theoretical, but let's come down to what we found, that when we talk about implementation, yes, India has had and even now has an idea about what are the correct reforms to do for agriculture. They have been devised, we say yes, by some world-class experts within India, as well as we say with consultation with stakeholders. Now, when I was in the Planning Commission and we looked at the histories of consultations and also how they were being done on the same matters we're talking about on land and so on, and we found that the consultation is really a pro forma. You get people and you say, we want to hear you. They sit in a room together, they say a few things or don't say anything. Then there's a record about who you consulted, and you take the decision that the few experts told you you should take. And this has been the pattern of the agriculture reform consultations for the last so many years. Okay, but so we can say so many consultations were held. The question was, what was the quality of those consultations? Who was included? Included doesn't mean just on the list. Did they feel heard? This is the point what you're saying. The media points out that actually they say they weren't heard. You say you heard them, they didn't hear you. Unki man ki baat nahi suni aapne. So this is where we came down to, that India and our experts and our government is feeling that we need to do firm, tough reforms guided by our best experts, and then we splutter along. So the implementation problem arises because of the earlier problem of how you went about determining what should be the reforms. And if the matter is complex, like you're pointing out, Shankar, yes, the number of stakeholders are very many and very diverse. They speak in various voices, and you have to have the ability early on to build a process early on to do that very quickly and effectively. If you don't do that quickly and effectively, then when you announce the reform, there will be a reaction. And of course, as I said, there always will be, you can't get anything perfect the first time, but we must reduce the number of iterations and the time it takes. This was the essence of the total quality movement in Japan, to use that metaphor. That, the Japanese were able to improve the levels of the industries from one level to the next much faster than the Europeans and Americans, who were also improving at the same time. And so the Japanese caught up, and thereafter they remained ahead because they were learning faster, and they were learning to do very complex things industrial reforms and so on. So I could share with you what we then did in the Planning Commission to look at the subject about jobs, industry, and manufacturing growth. And the process that we used was really declared to be the best reform process used in this matter in the world. But no one in India noticed the process and what came out of it. We still had the same solutions of the China type solution of having, big zones and so on put down. And I had the pleasure of two things after the Planning Commission was disbanded. One, to be invited to speak at international conferences of government leaders and development experts on how to do reforms in industry and manufacturing. So I'm teaching them something that we had learned but weren't applying. And the Niti Aayog is another thing that's given me great joy, because the Prime Minister disbanded the Planning Commission for reasons that Sanjeev has given us. And then he created a charter. If you read that charter, what does it say? The charter says National Institution for Transforming India by enabling the states to learn, by enabling India to operate like a flotilla of independent ships all sailing in the same direction. It was learning the processes of how reforms are made in states, at the center, in districts, and teaching people to work with others to make the reforms in their state. I'm using the word state more generically now. Now, this is where the Niti Aayog lately, I find, is going. But otherwise, we are again saying economics, what's economic reform? And we want experts in economics. And the experts in economics in the present Niti Aayog are probably just as good or just as bad as the experts were in the Planning Commission.
Well, the landscape, yeah, I mean, the landscape is the same. But yeah. I mean, I often remember something that I learned from Dr. Reddy when he was in the finance ministry, and Montek and others used to say. So the general belief was that there is a strong consensus for weak reforms because of the capacity of the state, and that the state is doing things that may not necessarily do, and is not doing things that it needs to do. But I'm just going to shift because we have a constraint of time. So I wanted to get Sanjeev into something that I hear is happening in the government, is to relook at whether we need all those departments, whether we need all those ministries. Maybe about 10 years back, I had done a cover story listing the number of ministries which really had no business existing. Things have changed. Maybe, I mean, we decontrolled steel in 1993. We still have a steel ministry. For the life of me, I can't understand why the rural development ministry the center should have. But these are all legacies that we are carrying, the 42nd Amendment problems that we are sort of carrying forward. Sanjeev, would you be sort of open to discussing on what's happening in terms of the reorganization of departments and ministries in the government?
So you're absolutely right. Since 1947, we have kept adding more and more departments and autonomous bodies and ministries and so on. Some happened because of political reasons, but some of them may have been perfectly reasonable things to do back in the 50s or 60s, but we didn't then shut them down afterwards. So this continuous accumulation of various kinds of organizations, which having once been established are extremely difficult to shut down. I mean, just to put it in context, the central government alone has some 800 autonomous bodies of various kinds. Some cultural bodies, some will relate to, obscure activities. Some of you may know, will be surprised to know, but they may have like 5 acres of land in the middle of Delhi, and a senior official who presides over whatever that activity is. So this kind of thing is all pervasive. It's there all over the country in state governments as well. What we are doing right now is finally relooking at many of these institutions, departments, autonomous bodies, and again beginning to cull them down. Now, again, there are two ways of going about it. One would have been the master plan approach, is to do a grand scan of every ministry and then sort of get what it should be ideally and try and implement that. But as I pointed out to you, our entire process is iterative. So what we are doing is exactly the opposite. We are going instead ministry by ministry and then autonomous body by autonomous body. So we are actually doing it sort of bottom up. And already dozens of such organizations have been rationalized, shut down, merged, and so on, as we speak. And I'll just tell you a few of them. For example, in the film industry, there used to be a whole bunch of these institutions. Children's Film Society, Films Division of India, and a whole bunch of them. They have now been basically merged into one. And hopefully now it will have a minimum amount of cluster of activities. And at the same time, there were many things which we should not have been doing in the government, which will not get done. And then, this minimum cluster will be able to upgrade its technology and so on. We did the same thing. We had something called, we have dozens of organizations to look at, say, for example, promotion of jute at the central level. I mean, I understand West Bengal having a lot of things at the ground, but central government had significant numbers, jute commissioner, Indian Jute Export Promotion Council, all kinds of jute related things. They have now got reduced in number. Similarly, there were a whole bunch of organizations for handicraft and handloom. So some of them have been rationalized, shut down, merged, like the All India Handicraft Board, All India Handloom Board. And many of these organizations were duplicating activities of others. Some of these boards had not met in 20 years, and yet their paraphernalia existed. So this is what is being done as we speak.
So one of the things that also sort of strikes me is that the locational issues of a department in a particular ministry, or the existence, I'm not talking about the existence of certain ministries, so that's a longer thing. For instance, I know that the Bureau of Industrial Standards, for instance, is in the Ministry of Consumer Affairs. I mean, beats logic, but there must be some logic to that. I mean, I would rather think that the Bureau of Industrial Standards should be in the Ministry of Industrial Development or the DIP, where you set standards on what you want to do. Similarly, the issue of skilling, for instance, which is going to be very critical, is sort of spread across two ministries, neither of which are owning it. Now, if you look at water, for instance, it's managed by 7 ministries. Health has some 70 laws. So these are things that actually define the efficiency or inefficiency of the state. I'm sort of hoping that the government's exercise in reviewing these issues will cover both locational and also existential questions.
No. So absolutely true. So, for example, there is one unit that is being looked at for, restructuring, which is the Salt Commission. The Salt Commission owns 60,000 acres of land along the India's coastline, including several thousand acres on Mumbai Island, which are hugely valuable. And there is a salt service which runs this. But ironically, almost none of the salt that you and I eat comes from the lands of the salt service. Basically, most salt is produced industrially. Yeah. But this institution, this is a 200-year-old institution, and it continues to exist because it continues to exist. And in fact, it's basically not nothing to do with salt. It simply manages legacy lands. So
salt of power.
Yes. So there are similar lots and lots of organizations. By the way, I'll give you one example of another one. There's something called a tariff commission. Now, whenever I mention the institution called tariff commission, most people assume that it has something to do with commerce and setting tariffs on imports and so on. Far from it, the tariff commission actually sits in DPIIT, the industry ministry. And what does it do? Well, it is a legacy from the pre-liberalization days, i.e. pre-1991 days, when internal tariffs of things like special steels, copper, etc., used to be set by the government. So the unit that was supposed to do it still exists. It has a full office with a secretary level head and scores of officials and so on. And so 30 years after liberalization, the unit that used to actually run this price setting of the socialist era still exists with a full complement of officials. So these are the kinds of institutions that need to be rationalized, redeployed. Many things need to be done. So, and that is being done.
I think I'm getting a message saying that I have to sort of try and bring a semicolon on this discussion, because no discussion on economic reforms can have a full stop. So I'm going to try and sort of wrap this up with a question for both you, Mr. Maira, and for you, Sanjeev. In the immediate future, in the immediate term of, when we are coming out of the lockdowns and COVID and everything, they're going to be facing several issues. So please suggest what you think are the two things that you would like the government to take up to push, so that not only we come out of this and the recovery is sustained, but we also sort of are able to shift orbit, in terms of how we deal with the future challenges. And some of the challenges we know, some we don't know all the challenges and how they will play out. But the two things that would sort of equip India to sort of look at the future, what would be those two things? First, you, Mr. Maira.
You pointed out that we got to do many things, and the COVID has brought about the urgency to do many things at the same time. It's not just a public health problem that we got to address, it's an education problem. It is also, as you mentioned, the water and our physical environment problem, and well as the banking sector and so many problems all at the same time, Okay, so what this is going to require is a different approach on two dimensions in how we make reforms and policies and implement them. One is we need much better systems thinking amongst anybody and everybody who is at the helm of reforms and policy making, and even going deeper levels down. Systems thinking. This is not the way that we as experts usually think. We'll think about a narrow domain in which we have the precise solutions. Systems thinking. The second is collaborative policy making. So this point about, breaking departments, you'll have to break big governments into departments anyway, but nothing like the skills one that you mentioned can be given to just one ministry, because the skills will be created by activities in many ministries. You may not have a steel ministry separately, but you'll have something to look after industry. Maybe they are responsible for skills, so why have a separate skills ministry? And so on. So this whole thing that we can by structure solve this problem is way of thinking we have to change. We must improve structures like Sanjeev has said. Some things become dead, they must be weeded out because they're taking cost and delaying decision making because they get involved and should not be. But we are going to have divisions into structures in any complex organization. To work collaboratively amongst them, it's an orientation and a skill as well as systems thinking. And this is what we found, that the training of our people to think as systems thinkers and to then work collaboratively is what Niti Aayog has been charged to do in the charter. This is the single point agenda with which we'll make many reforms much more effectively and more quickly than we have been able to so far.
Sanjeev, one of the things that I sort of keep thinking about is 30 years after dismantling of license Raj, which is basically what the reforms in 91 were, we also sort of have not moved, because in terms of, like, for instance, for a power project, it takes over 90 clearances, for a hotel about 110 clearances. And although we are much more efficient in our clearances, has there been any rethink on whether those clearances are required at all? Whether those files should move yo-yo up and down between, say, Kanpur and Delhi and Kanpur and Lucknow and Kanpur and Delhi, I mean, that's one thing that sort of I'm hoping that your exercise sort of looks into that. But your two things that you think that will make a difference for India.
Well, since you're talking about immediate issues, well, obviously one immediate issue that we will pay attention to is to make sure that the infrastructure build-out push that we promised in the budget is carried out and followed through, because critically that is a major part of our attempt to rebuild economic momentum. So that is one thing that we are paying very close attention. And the second thing, which fits with what you just mentioned, is just like we are looking at the structures of government, we are also looking at structures of policies and regulations. And the way we go about it, as you may have noticed, is unlike in the past, by the way, the economic survey you will see is a very good guide to how things are being thought about. So one of the chapters you may want to read is the chapter 6 in volume 1, which makes the intellectual case for simplifying regulations. So if you read that, we make a very strong case for simplification of regulations, which is a very different case than the one, say, the libertarians would do for deregulation. We have a different reason why we want to simplify regulations. And that is something that we are already doing in a big way. If you look at the last few months, we have done massive deregulations in several sectors. For example, the geospatial and cartography sector, just 10 days ago, we completely opened it up. Similarly, there were these outdated regulations, telecom regulations on the BPO and IT sector. And I can't believe that we had those regulations on OSPs. And those have been completely removed. And we recognize that even after removing them, there'll be another 3 things that we hadn't thought need removing will pop up, and we'll discover them. We will then work on those and remove those as well. So, minimum government, maximum governance. Unfortunately, people, given their proclivities, look at one or the other, but actually they only make sense when they go together. And so we are doing a lot of deregulation as we speak.
Fair enough. One of these days, we should have a session again and invite Mr. Maira and you and sort of look at the cause and effect of the reforms that are being done and how they work through. And probably we'll have to wait for another occasion for this. But thank you, both of you. This has been a very lively discussion. And it's a good thing that we focused on the thinking, the approach, the strategy, rather than just tactical issues, which anyway are being sort of spoken and discussed about. I hope this discussion sort of goes further. And thank you for your participation.
Thank you.
Thank you, Shankar. Thank you, Sanjeev, too.
We hope you enjoyed that session. If you want to catch the other sessions of the ThinkEdu Conclave 2021, you can log on to eventexpress.com, newindianexpress.com, or even edexlive.com. If you are more of a social media person, you can also join us on our Facebook, Twitter, and YouTube handles. Thank you for watching.